Hi, everyone. Today we will be discussing the academic article Service Reform, Examining State and Local Government Cases by Battaglio Jr. and Stephen E. Condrey. Both Paul is at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and Dr. Condrey, they're both doctors, is my bad, is at the University of Georgia. So overall, this article discusses how civil service influences personnel policies. Civil services are largely seeking reforms in how they are managed. A lot of civil service systems are currently managed with a merit system. So as people have been there longer and score higher on administrative tests, they will have more opportunities for promotion. There are some efforts to change that and make it more determined by the boss's opinion and personal recommendations and things like that. Federalism in the United States allows for diverse, smaller scale reforms before a federal government reform. Federalism, of course, is this idea that the federal government operates on a different level than the state government and the local government, and each have some freedom in how they operate their systems. This study and this presentation are going to analyze some civil service reform examples in Georgia, Florida, New York, Louisiana, Birmingham, Alabama, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Major stakeholders must always opt in to any change for it to be effective. So if an organization is trying to change, they need the employees to want this change to occur, as well as major leaders and perhaps other organizations who are involved as well. It's best or most successful when administrative-oriented reform is incremental or occurring over time, rather than an immediate drastic change. Reforms typically start at the local level and then inspire state and federal reforms. If we see something working well at the local level, it's more likely to be considered a successful program that might have successful implications for higher levels of government as well. In the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, local reforms were inspired by the federal government. But now, of course, as I just said in the last bullet, it is the opposite, with many reforms being inspired, many federal reforms being inspired by the local government. There are some different methods to human resource management and reforming. There is the traditional model, the reform model, the strategic model, and the privatization or outsourcing model, which is new. So as we go through those examples from across the United States, we'll analyze which model best fits those examples. The first example is from Georgia. In the Georgia Act of 816 of 1996, there was a removal of civil service protection, decentralization of authority, and establishment of a new performance management system using performance-based pay. So this, of course, would no longer require consultation with HR before hiring. It gave the agencies more flexibility in downsizing and discipline, and created a lack of uniformity that brought into question fairness across different agencies. This change is an example of the reform model. It was created by powerful Governor Zell Miller, who worked in human resources and hated personnel rules and regulations. They can be really challenging for individuals to work around when they're working for the government. So that was his goal there in decentralization and less reliance on strict rules and these merit system policies. In Florida, when Jeb Bush was governor, he tried to reform the civil service system, but it led to mismanagement and abuse. So whereas the example in Georgia on the previous slide was largely positive, seen as a positive change, Florida's was not seen as much of a positive change. It eliminated seniority policies immediately rather than that gradual implementation that we talked about most likely to be successful. Georgia had phased out their seniority policies, so this was quite a change from the previous example. Florida created minimum qualifications for positions that were intended to simplify and expedite selection. And it also eliminated classification statuses, which mainly affected employees with a manager or supervisor title and made promotions and pay raises more subject to discretion rather than seniority, who had been working there longer, who scored as well on standardized exams for specific jobs. Essentially, the People First initiative contracted out many previously government functions to the private industry. This was the largest privatization project of the Jeb Bush administration. This program faced a lawsuit stating that this Service First project unconstitutionally waived collective bargaining rights, or what many of the workers wanted. Florida's reforms tend to fit the reform model or the privatization or outsourcing model. And these changes threaten Florida public service, civil service, political neutrality. So having more managers say in these kinds of things open up a possibility for some favoritism for people of a specific political party or with specific values and beliefs that align to a politician at the time. In New York, this is another example. Governor George Pataki asked Civil Service Commissioner George Sinnott to head a task force to create a comprehensive overview of the civil service system before attempting a new systematic change. Of course, a good research, a good overview is always a great idea before implementing any huge change. So together, the two, after they created the report, created a new civil service through incremental change, so small changes over time, and through involving unions, which again, in the last case in Florida, was one of the reasons they faced a lawsuit, because the unions or the majority of workers were not particularly fond of the program that Governor Jeb Bush created. Part of New York's reform process was centralizing the Department of Civil Service in order to move employees around when needed rather than just let them go. So to have everybody technically working for the same government entity would allow them to have some flexibility to rezone people or give them a new role rather than fire them if their agency didn't have funding or a need for them after a long-term project ended, for example. This also would allow employees to compete for permanent status within each agency. And the reform also led to the creation of a website with centralized information regarding upcoming exams and performance review results. This is kind of an older article. I believe it was in like 2006. So now pretty much all government entities have a website with something like that. But of course, it was noteworthy at the time. And of course, these changes have to have happened at some moment, and they were once a groundbreaking new idea. This website change, the creation of the website, streamlined hiring and encouraged hiring to be based not only on test scores. Unions would also require additional procedures when dealing with dismissal, discipline, hiring, or salaries. And New York's reform typically fits the strategic model of human resource management. The next example is about Louisiana. Louisiana sought to privatize the Louisiana Department of Economic Development into something different called Louisiana Inc. That would be the private version under Governor Foster in the year 2000. This was another initiative that proposed combining the office of the secretary. So that was one initiative, this changing of the Louisiana Department of Economic Development into a privatized industry. Another initiative was combining the Office of the Secretary, the Office of Management and Finance, and the Office of Business Development. And another third initiative created Ascend 2020, which would decentralize personnel training, reorganize the Department of State Civil Service, establish a website for vacancies, and convert paper records to digital records. It would also create the Assistance Division, which would be a single point of contact responsible for civil service knowledge. And it would create an online portal for applications that has helped with recruitment for special announcements of vacancies. So again, things like that, and this thing about converting paper records to digital records. Of course, that seems so obvious to us now, but people had to spend, I'm sure this was a very long-term project to convert all of these paper records to digital records. This policy largely follows the strategic model, and they implemented the new policies slowly over Foster's 8-year administration, which allowed for careful attention to detail and effective implementation. Again, these ones with incremental implementation are typically the most successful. Our next example comes from Jefferson County, Alabama, which is in the city of Birmingham, is included in that county. The federal courts actually ordered reforms here. In 2002, the Personnel Board was found guilty of violating terms of a 1995 anti discrimination decree. Sims was ordered to oversee this process and began to reorganize the board. Sims's first priority was to address the fact that many employees were underqualified and ignored rules and regulations. I'm sorry, so this is actually the opposite. Sims had a budget of $7 million for reforms and attempted to raise 8.5 million more from localities. And despite these reforms, and it's a pretty well-funded project, Jefferson County still largely relies on traditional civil service models with a heavy reliance on objective tests. One of Chapel Hill's greatest strengths is the Human Resource Management Relations Committee, which meets to discuss updated policies and practices and voice concerns. This is the last example, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Chapel Hill's competitive compensation and benefits allow them to compete effectively in recruitment. Being open to change and collaboration is an important aspect of any town. Chapel Hill's effective human resource staff manages large-scale projects and coordinates with consultants for classification studies. Chapel Hill is focused on collaboration, goal orientation, multi-directional communication, integral roles for human resources staff, and emphasis on education. This uses the strategic model. All right, that's it for this article. It was interesting to look at some specific case studies.